Welcome to this special podcast of the People's Pharmacy. Today, Joe and I are talking with Erin Sharoni, entrepreneur and co-founder of Juvicell. Erin is also a master's degree candidate in biology at Harvard University with a thesis focused on epigenetics. Juvicell produces a multi-ingredient longevity supplement. We have no financial interest in the company. We thought you might like to listen to this interview in conjunction with our interviews on related topics with Dr. David Sinclair and Dr. Terrie Moffitt. You'll find them in People's Pharmacy Show 1263. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Erin Sharoni.
Thanks so much for having me on.
We're delighted to be able to talk to you, Erin. I think a lot of people believe that their genes control their destiny. If dad lived to 63 and mom made it to 68, they don't expect to get much past 70. Why is that reasoning wrong?
Well, I'm assuming that many of your listeners who've heard all of the excellent guests that you've had on over the years might be familiar with this concept, but the environment really plays a bigger role in your lifespan destiny, so to speak, than your genes alone. And in fact, if folks are familiar with your epigenome, the field of epigenetics is very popular now. So that's essentially the collection of chemical marks on your DNA that control the regulation or the expression of your genes. And so the idea is that, if the to use an analogy, if the genes are the gun, the environment pulls the trigger, right? So you might have something loaded that some people might think, well, I've got a genetic mutation that may predispose me to a certain disease or a certain trait. But it's really the environmental factors that are working to control whether or not that takes place. If that makes sense, trying to distill it into a very simple.
Sure. Erin, I think many of our listeners have heard the term epigenetics because we've been talking about it, or they know a little something about the epigenome, but maybe not a lot. When you say markers on your DNA, could you explain what you mean?
Sure. So there are chemical changes that occur to the DNA and the histone proteins. Some people might be familiar with that word. And those chemical changes, there's a record of them. That's your epigenome. And the important thing to understand about that, without going into all of the chemistry, is that those chemical marks or modifications are both heritable and can be inherited from the environment, from interactions with the environment, and as well as things like aging. So it can sort of occur over time. So there's those sort of three different ways of thinking about it. Some folks might be familiar with the concept of DNA methylation. And that's when you add a methyl group to a transcription start site in the DNA. So I'm again trying to keep this as high level as possible without going down a rabbit hole. But I think that the important thing to understand there, like I said, is that there's this record of these chemical marks, and that's involved in controlling the expression of the genes and the manufacturing of various proteins. So in terms of the role of the epigenome in development, for instance, one can imagine that as a fetus is developing from the very, very, very early stages on through, the full development cycle, cells need to know what kind of cells they need to become, right? There has to be sort of a cellular fate. So there's this thing called Waddington's landscape. If anyone's interested, they can look that up. But essentially, the idea is that, you've got the same DNA in every cell, right? But not every cell is the same type of cell. You've got a liver cell and a fibroblast, a skin cell, right? And so each of those cells would have a different collection or set of those chemical marks in the epigenome. And then there's, of course, like I was saying, as you age, there are changes to that epigenome. David Sinclair talks a lot about that. And of course, if you smoke, or if you're really stressed out, or if you get sick, or if you're in an environment where there's a lot of chemical exposure, or you're exposed to radiation, that's a really big DNA damager, then the picture of those sets of chemical marks will change.
So what I'm gleaning from what you're saying, Erin, is that there are a lot of factors that affect our gene expression, and they probably include things like how we live our lives, our diet, how much we sleep, how much we exercise or don't exercise, how much stress we're underway. And you mentioned toxic chemicals. So, a lot of people have kind of thought, well, my future is in the stars, not in myself. But what you're saying is, no. You can influence how your genes express themselves.
Absolutely. To some extent, we can't control everything. And there's certainly, some highly penetrant traits that will manifest in diseases. Let's say something like Huntington's disease, unfortunately, if you're going to get that, you're going to get it, right? If you have, that particular set of alleles. So in that sense, that's what we'd call a highly penetrant trait. And that is sadly, until we can figure out how to do otherwise, that is your fate. But yeah, with that's why basic lifestyle modifications are so important, right? What you eat is really important. How you live is really important. All of these things influence your body in many, many ways. And one of those ways can be, I think, looked at to some degree on the genetic expression level.
Erin, we want to talk about the supplement that your company Juvicell offers. But first, I'd like to know, is there any way that we can tell if our bodies are getting older faster than we think they should? Are there biomarkers?
So I'm not an expert in assessing aging, so I don't want to say something that isn't necessarily accurate. That's not my particular area of expertise, but sure, there are various phenotypes that are observable, right? I mean, there's very basic things like your skin wrinkling and to some extent gray hair, although people get gray hair at very early ages as well, which is partly stress induced and partly genetic. But the way that you feel physically, how you perform, how your joints are working, right? Those are all indicators of vitality to some extent. And so there are epigenetic clocks. I'm sure that you've had prior guests on the show talking about that. And so with some degree of accuracy, these are pretty high fidelity multi-tissue clocks. They're very complex algorithms. The first one was developed by Dr. Steve Horvath at UCLA. I think most folks who know about this area are familiar with him. And so that was basically a way to say, okay, by looking at the changes in your epigenome over time, right? So this is a longitudinal analysis, but also you could look at it at a specific point in time. We can estimate your biological age. And they did that quite successfully with a few different clocks. And so I think those tools like that are becoming higher fidelity as time goes on. And so, with some degree of accuracy, you could say today, we can estimate somebody's age based on that. Of course, that science is always evolving and we're learning more. So I would say that's a reasonable marker or collection of marks.
I'd like to ask about the supplement that Juvicell offers for anti-aging. How did you decide to include a couple of these compounds that people may have heard of? For example, curcumin.
Yeah, so curcumin has been very, very well studied over the years, and its effects are fairly well understood. Its effects, on the inflammatory process, and its effects on aging ultimately. So ultimately for all of the Juvicell ingredients, they were included based on an abundance of scientific literature and in vivo studies. So whether that was animal in vivo studies and or human in vivo studies. And those studies are evolving, so we're always following the science and seeing how things change and we'll adjust the formula accordingly when and if we need to. But all of those ingredients were selected for that reason.
Okay. I think a lot of people have heard of curcumin and they know that it's the yellow compound in turmeric. But here's one that probably not so many people know much about. Tell us, if you would, please, about sulforaphane.
Sure. So sulforaphane is an exciting one. If people have heard of it, then they'll know it as the broccoli supplement. But essentially, when your mom said, eat your broccoli, she was right in more ways than she knew, as it turns out. So sulforaphane is, it's a sulfur-rich compound that's found in the cruciferous veggie family. So that includes broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, but most especially in broccoli sprouts. And it's been pretty well studied for its role in various things, but certainly in cancer prevention. And there's a lot of promise that it's shown in various studies for other areas of health and longevity. So, there's a number of pathways that it works on. Overall, it appears to exert anti-inflammatory effects. And as your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with, inflammation is not only associated with disease, but is a leading cause of aging. And in fact, scientists even use the word inflammaging. And another thing folks might have heard of when they hear about sulforaphane, or even if they hear about it, it's just broccoli extract, right? Some people might call it that, is that it activates detoxification pathways. And so back to your earlier comment about, toxins in the environment, or I think I said chemicals, right? Let's say you're living in a highly polluted area, your body's ability to detoxify may be compromised over time. There are a lot of reasons for that. But regardless, enhancing detox pathways, which become compromised also as we age, is really important. And there's evidence to actually back that up. There have been studies where they've shown a higher excretion of carcinogenic chemicals. I think the chemical that they looked at was benzene and other harmful metabolites by, after using a broccoli sprout derived supplement. So I could go on and on with many, many examples.
Well, you know what I find so interesting, Erin, about broccoli sprouts? Most people are familiar with broccoli. They go, yeah, I mean, if they're not George W. Bush, a lot of people like broccoli. I like broccoli. Broccoli sprouts are a little bitter. They're not quite as tasty as regular, quote unquote, broccoli. So I'm guessing it's perhaps that bitter flavor that may have some of those sulforaphane ingredients that are so valuable. And I think there are a lot of people who go, yeah, I'm not that fond of cabbage. I don't much like Brussels sprouts. They're a little bitter to my taste. So can you just give us a little quick insight on how those natural chemicals have such powerful benefits, but they may not always be as tasty as some of the other vegetables that we're familiar with?
Sure. So I know our friend David Sinclair talked about this, but he always says, eat stressed plants, right? So Juvicell is largely made up of polyphenols. Polyphenols are important phytochemicals that are found in lots of plants. And what they do is they help to defend the plant against cellular stressors. So it's like a plant defense mechanism, right? And then when we eat those super stressed plants, that can switch on these pathways that are anti-inflammatory and support, things like mitochondrial function. And so, that's, to answer your question, perhaps I'm not exactly sure about the flavor, and some people might be more, averse to the flavor of broccoli sprouts than others. I actually think they're quite tasty. But that is one reason why these polyphenols are so important for us to consume.
Erin, another compound we'd like to ask you about is resveratrol. Some people have heard about this as the compound in red wine, but you'd have to drink an awful lot of red wine, probably more than is good for you, to get very much resveratrol, right?
Yeah, that is true. And what's actually even more interesting, which people may be less familiar with than resveratrol, is its cousin, which is pterostilbene, which is also in Juvicell. They're both in Juvicell. And people may not have heard of pterostilbene, but resveratrol is a precursor molecule of pterostilbene. And they're both potent antioxidants. They both have anti-inflammatory properties. Pterostilbene is abundantly found mostly in blueberries, whereas when we think of resveratrol, we think of grapes or red wine. But resveratrol is notoriously poorly bioavailable. So, you need to consume it with fat. And even then it has to be super high quality, which not all supplements are. But according to some studies, pterostilbene might actually be more bioavailable than resveratrol. And the combination of the two is thought to be even more effective. But we can go into that in a bit. I would just say that, pterostilbene in particular is interesting because it's been found to induce autophagy and apoptosis. So
Whoa,
autophagy.
whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay. I know those are perfectly good words, but I think we need definitions.
Sure. So autophagy, you can think of like your cellular housekeeping, right? It's you need to sweep up the debris, just like you would clean your house and keep everything in order. You don't want a buildup of cellular debris floating around. And apoptosis is cell death. So that's important because you don't also want to have aberrant cells lingering around. If a cell is going to turn into something that's undesirable, like a cancer cell. Cancer cells are immortal. That means there is no apoptosis, right? They don't die. They keep proliferating. So those are two really important processes for maintaining cellular homeostasis and improving your longevity overall. So pterostilbene has been shown to induce both of those important processes and then mediate some cellular damage in some cases as well. So with both pterostilbene and resveratrol, and there's a bit of controversy around resveratrol, there has been for a long time. I think ultimately the research nets out in its favor. But I can say that we understand pretty well that the main benefits of these compounds appear to be a couple of things. One, that they may potentially mimic a calorie-restricted diet, which is very important when you're thinking about longevity. They might help to mitigate mitochondrial dysfunction. Again, that's a hallmark of aging. They may improve metabolic function. I think everyone understands that that's important. They may also promote fat mobilization and breakdown. And some studies also point to evidence, at least for pterostilbene, in supporting brain health and suggesting there's a vascular protective effect. So that could be good for heart health as well. Mostly this information comes from animal studies. So human studies are, being done now, but it's early and they're showing promise. So I always say that because it's really important. You can learn a lot from in vitro studies, but we do need, it's always best to have human studies as well.
Well, Erin, that really brings us to our take-home message today on the People's Pharmacy, and that is that these ingredients and several others, including quercetin and coenzyme Q10, they're fascinating to me, and they have some really interesting biology, but it's going to take clinical trials decades to prove what works and what doesn't work to improve longevity. A lot of the researchers will probably be dead before the results of their studies are actually revealed. But what should people be doing in the meantime right now to live the longest and best they possibly can?
Sure, that's a great question. I'm sure some of those researchers hope that they won't be dead because they'll have figured out the key to unlocking, some extension of lifespan. But yes, your point stands, and people can do a whole lot, to optimize, particularly their health span, which I think is a really important distinction. We're always talking about longevity and lifespan, but I have yet to meet any person that says they wish to live longer, but not in a healthy state. Right? We've all seen what happens. It happens very commonly. People age and they're unable to function and they have round-the-clock care and their quality of life is very poor. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't do everything we can to extend their lifespan, but it's a personal choice at some point, right? And the idea, I think, what we should all strive for is optimizing both health span and lifespan. So I say that because the things that will help you to ostensibly live longer should also help you to live healthier. And these are really basic things that most people already know. So it might sound boring, but, making sure that you get high quality sleep. And as I'm sure you guys are familiar with from prior interviews, that doesn't just mean only getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, but that means going to sleep at a time that is, commensurate with your circadian clock. And also, very importantly, not varying your wake up and sleep time by very much. So Matthew Walker talks about that a lot, and there's some pretty good data to back that up. Exercise, of course, is very important. Fasting is probably the best thing. that one can do to optimize their lifespan and health span. And fasting can occur in many different ways. I'm actually on a fast right now, so I apologize if any of my answers have been a bit slow. But you can do time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting. You can also do periodic fasting. Again, all of that under the advice of a physician, I would always say. Some folks will fast for 2 days a month. I'm currently doing a 5-day fasting mimicking diet that Walter Longo created, and that's been very well studied. And in fact, if you look at the longest lived areas of the world, those cultures, and you look at actually all the major religions, there's a lot of fasting involved. And there's a reason for that, right? That would be a whole other episode talking about the pathways that it activates and how it supports the body. But just at a very basic level, I think the average person can probably understand, I'm giving my body a rest, right? You're giving your digestive system a rest, and you're allowing all those processes like autophagy, which becomes upregulated, to take place. So clearing out the debris, basically. So that's really important. And then there's a whole lot of evidence for eating more plants. So I follow a plant-based diet, and the literature really has shown time and time again that a predominantly plant-based diet is the one that will allow you to live the best, the longest, whether that's Mediterranean diet or whether that's, a whole food plant-based diet. I think that's really critical. And without those pillars, there isn't a magic pill. So something like Juvicell is wonderful, but it's meant to supplement, a healthy lifestyle. It's not meant to reverse any damage that you're inflicting upon your body 3 times a day with the food that you eat, or, by not sleeping, things like that.
Oh, that's a really important message. Erin Sharoni, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
From Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terrie Graydon.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of the People's Pharmacy Podcast.